To Cybersecurity Distilled with Andy Bennett.
Hello and welcome to another Cybersecurity Distilled. This is an Apollo Information Systems production, and I am your host, Andy Bennett. And today with me is my friend, Elliot. Elliot, tell us who you are and where you do it.
Hi, I'm Elliot Graebert. I've been doing DevOps and security engineering for about, over 10 years now. I'm right now taking some time to spend some time with the holidays, doing a little bit of advising for some startups and kind of just enjoying some downtime.
Downtime is good. I'm looking forward to having some of that. I haven't had it in a while. I did just buy a new chainsaw, so later on that's going to date this episode for me. I'm looking forward to having some fun with that this weekend. So
Awesome.
What are you doing on the Cybersecurity Distilled podcast? So your background is not that of my normal guest, and I've had lots of different types of guests. So why are you here other than to have a drink with me in the afternoon?
Well, I partnered directly with Palantir's CISO for many years when I was running the internal infrastructure. And so I've been working hand in hand with security teams for a very long time. I've done a lot of work in compliance, both practical and non-practical compliance. And security has been something that for at least Palantir was absolutely paramount. So I feel like I've been hanging out with security nerds for quite a long time.
Well, arguably, you might have been a security nerd. You were just in a different office.
Had a different name. Exactly. I was just down I think I was a floor down from the SOC.
Exactly. So, and one of those CISOs is Jeff, right?
Yes, I was there, for Jeff's tenure, and then Jeff's replacement, and then the replacement to that replacement. So I got to see the whole thing. It was absolutely fascinating going through, seeing how various CISOs, what they prioritize, how they interact, strengths and weaknesses. Absolutely fascinating, because if you're able to stay at a single place and watch the transition between different leaders, you get to see how each individual person's personality actually shapes an organization.
So that's actually ties into a topic that I've had discussions with multiple guests and lots of colleagues and peers around the country about, which is there's always this dynamic in this discussion about where the CISO should sit in an organization, who should they report to, what should their purview cover, and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, the answer that I like to give is that if you've got the right person, it doesn't even matter where they sit, so long as they're empowered. And it's the right person and people, because if the CIO is a strategic business leader who's not focused on operations, but is strategically focused on advancing the whole of the organization, the CISO can answer to that person, no problem. If the CIO keeps getting dragged down into firefighting and is focused on operations, and the CISO is expected to still advance strategic concerns for security, it's not a good organizational structure. In fact, it's set up to fail by default. Likewise, if the CISO doesn't report to the CIO, but is entirely antagonistic to the things that drive the business and the things to which the CIO is beholden, it's set up for failure. And it's one of the few times where I usually say you don't design an organization against people, but it's one of the few times and a key position where people make or break it. And so I'm interested in your perspective. What is the best personality trait you've witnessed that makes a CISO successful, speaking from the perspective of a critical stakeholder where you work? And what is the worst one? And you don't have to name names, of course, but what's the best personality trait you've seen that helps enable success for the CISO, regardless of where they sit in the organization? And what's the worst trait you've seen?
I think the most powerful trait would be collaboration. I worked for a bit for Palantir with one of the CISOs, and she was extremely good at navigating the waters and helping people feel connected, helping people feel empowered, and just very good at when she needed you to do something. It felt less like the big scary, security guys coming down to yank your chain. It felt like a partnership. The result was the same. She said jump, and I went how high, but it was a really excellent way to make me feel like I was part of the story, part of the education. And then my desire and willingness to pull everyone else along down the same path was way up there. So I definitely say it's more just like casual collaboration, but really your ability to make people feel like they are part of the story.
So you said thank you for the exercise instead of, man, that was a rough landing on my knees, right?
She would always keep a thing of old fashions on her desk. And when there was a tough conversation, she'd pour you an old fashioned, you'd sit down. But as silly as that sounds, that was what was necessary sometimes to have a hard conversation, was to have this like other human element to it. So I learned a lot from just the small things that aren't even directly technically related that end up being very powerful.
I have found as a CISO that the technical stuff is important because it drives the organization, and it's the thing the bad guys will use to compromise you, but they also use the people, as we all know. But it's the non-technical stuff that really makes or breaks the success of the CISO and the security of the organization. 100%.
To piggyback on that, if I can, something I find very interesting between security and DevOps is whenever I'd talk and I'd be in the SOC with the security team, they'd often feel like they're the bottom rung of the ladder and that they're always the one doing whatever, being the ones to clean things up, being the ones that are called in. And at the same time, on the DevOps side, we all said the same thing, that we felt like we were the bottom rung of the ladder and that everything was stepping down. And it was just really interesting as you started to strengthen your emotional IQ and build empathy between the groups, how much everyone was aligned with like wanting to do right by the business. Just they had so much different information on what right means. And so when the collaboration aspect and getting people to work together in partnerships, it was just so much easier when you realize that everyone's actually wants the same thing. They just don't know the same information.
Well, and there's also the element of communication, right? You can only feel marginalized if you have been ignored at some point. And I'm just as guilty of it periodically as anybody ever is, right? Of not remembering to tell everybody everything. And even just yesterday, I was talking with one of my team members, and they said that they felt actually like pretty out of the loop. So they were a little hesitant to take on the thing I was asking them to take on. And I said, what are you actually, like, what do you think the gap is in your understanding? And it turns out that he wasn't actually out of the loop, but nobody had let him know that nothing had changed.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So things were exactly as he thought they were, but there had been enough change elsewhere in the organization that he wasn't still sure that the things he knew were still true. And that's on me, right? 100%. So I apologize to him, and we've moved on, and he's now doing the thing that I asked him to do and was hoping he'd do, because he's definitely the right guy for it. And later on, if he ever watches this, he'll know exactly who I'm talking. That one person's going to know who I'm talking to and about.
Let's say it's now been immortalized in this conversation. That it's like forever, just that.
Absolutely. So actually, you didn't answer my second question. What's the negative trait? What have you seen? What's not helpful?
I think when you have a security team that's been marginalized or not pulled into the conversation enough, one of the natural reactions can turn into one of those more like salty security teams where they kind of build up a very thick outer shell and start creating a us versus them mentality and pieces like that. And you can get a disconnect where even if both sides wants what's best for security, that collaboration stuff can really fall through. And so, I don't know. It's a tear. It's a tear between that and really caring about actual security versus theoretical security. I'm kind of torn between both of those being a thing. So so on one side, I guess it's just being too callous and too salty, which DevOps engineers as well are very famous for their saltiness. So like, it's definitely a pot calling the kettle black, but that's definitely like a demeanor issue that can make it really difficult to work with security team. But then I think the other side, it's really easy to get stuck and push forward a security thing that isn't meaningfully targeting. I've mostly been exposed to security teams that are on the other side of it, but they had talked about horror stories from other groups. But I've mostly been around security teams that were very, very conscious about being the opposite of that.
Well, that's good, because I've definitely run into the salty sysadmin, the salty security guy, the salty DevOps, and my favorite part is when you start using vocab, right? The jargon that each one of these guys just lights them up, like when you say DevSecOps or SecDevOps or things, and some of them are like, well, we already do that, and others of them are somewhere in the "that's not a real thing" camp, and it's fantastic. I love poking the bear with by just adjusting a syllable.
The thing I've found throughout both sides of the house is that nobody, and I know both sides feel the same way, nobody goes to a DevOps person and says, basically, what a great job you did not letting something fall over today. Or on the security side, I'm fairly certain unanimously, you guys never get complimented for not having a breach on a given day. So it's a very interesting psychology feedback cycle where the amount of positive feedback that rolls into your door, I'm assuming, is, for your industry, pretty universally small, right?
Well, isn't that the case? Like that's technology and IT in general. People don't complain or kudos, it worked. It did what it's supposed to do. I don't say good job every time my kid says thank you after I hand them something. You don't get rewarded for just doing what you're supposed to do. And the problem is that IT is supposed to support the business and keep it running. So if the business is supported and still running, how do you rise above that bar to get recognized? Because, frankly, it's not super appropriate to recognize what is supposed to be happening as going above and beyond. Now, if you have gone 400 days with no incidents, one, I hesitate to recognize that because you're inviting trouble, right? But two, that might be when you see a long-term trend of continued excellence, that might be good. But in IT, where you have control over whether things go down quite frequently, for acts of God, nature, etc., don't count against this. They would keep you from making your metrics. But in security, none of us are in charge or have any control over whether or not the bad guys chose to target us that day. There's lots of things we can do, and there's lots of things that are table stakes that have to be done that should make sure that it's not something that's super low-hanging fruit that cuts through. But we're not in charge of whether or not the bad guys target us that day. And so it's extra dicey in how do you recognize excellence for people doing things or not having an incident, right? We haven't had an incident in 400 days. Congratulations. They've been targeting oil and gas this quarter or this year, right? Or whatever. And we're in finance, so makes sense. You don't get credit for that. Have you ever seen, and what would you credit a security team with if you wanted to go and offer kudos that are appropriate, that aren't good job, you did what you were supposed to do?
So I've said definitely for the DevOps and security side of the house, that the number one source of positive feedback and stuff are going to come from each other, infrastructure teams and security teams passing feedback to each other. Usually for me, it's the engagements, because something you can definitely measure to a degree is the quality of an engagement and the level of, the quality of the conversation that you have. So I'm thinking of moments where I had met with the security person. They had poked through a bunch of the holes in our ideas and some of the ways we wanted to deploy things. But they did so in a very friendly way, in a way that made us want to really collaborate together on how to fix those issues. And I sent a message to their lead later that day saying it was just such a pleasant conversation that even though what we had wasn't going to go to production because it was missing some pieces, we didn't feel as much like we were blocked. We felt like we were empowered to work together to come to get to those next steps. So, and it's just the demeanor and pleasantness of the conversation. The outcome was still the same. You're not going to prod with this. Not going to happen.
Yeah, and at what time, at which interval did they engage you for that conversation? Because we're supposed to go live tomorrow. Have you checked with security? Oh crap, no. Right. And it's a business critical thing. It has to go live tomorrow. You check with security. Security's like, you can't go live with this. I feel like that's a slightly different discussion than they were engaged at the right time, where you still had a window to correct anything that was wrong. Which one did you get?
I don't remember in this particular case. I've been on both sides where I've engaged security early on in projects, late in projects right before going live, every intermix in between them. It's actually why I love the DevOps movement. But something I find very interesting is today everyone hears DevOps and they are hearing infrastructure as code-based script monkey infrastructure person, which is not actually the DevOps movement.
Go on.
The DevOps movement was about applying lean manufacturing practices to the software development lifecycle in a holistic way. So one of the key points in there, the Bible for this movement really became the Phoenix Project book, which I think is a great book. It brings up the security team in particular, bringing up engaging the security team on the first day. And they used a car metaphor, like you wouldn't bring in the person who knows about aerodynamics after you've built the car right before you're about to put it on the road. That's insane. You'd pull the electronics person, the aerodynamics person, you pull everyone into the early design phase and figure some of those things out immediately. And the same thing on the software development side, like engaging security at the very beginning of a project while there's still all the unknowns and plenty of time to shape the direction, and treating security as a part of the development team, not as the checkbox at the gating function. So that part of DevOps to me, I like, is that style of thinking. Like, how do you pull people in early into the project?
Do you think that teams that focus on the alternative definition, the colloquial or connotative definition that people have adopted, do you think that those guys are the ones that are more at risk of not doing it right in terms of including security?
I am afraid to say anything that's too much of a blanket statement. My gut just says that a lot of people took it was like this morph between we should figure out how to reduce work in progress and automate processes, that turned into we should throw more software engineering talent at infrastructure problems, which turned into the most valuable hire is someone who has software chops but can do infrastructure, which then got labeled as DevOps. And then everyone wanted to label themselves as a DevOps engineer, applying for DevOps roles, because that was the right title and thing to say. But then the underlying practices that they have, since it's diverse, it's probably what I would say is like probably not strongly correlated, right? So you could have two different DevOps teams. One of them is using practices like pulling the security team early into the project, another one that doesn't. And the title that they have is meaningless. It's the organization they're in. It's the leads that they have. It's the individuals that make or break it.
It's the individuals again. There we are. Yep, absolutely. Kudos for not taking the bait. I was trying to get you to make some blatant statement. Well done. Well done.
Cheers.
So you're based in Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
Like it there?
I was in California for 12 years, but I grew up in Maine for 20 years. So people in Colorado.
You're a third of the way home then.
Yeah, I'm partway there. I'm used to snows like in upstate New York and Maine, where you'd get 36, 40 inches of snow in a single storm. And so I moved to California, whatever, came over to Colorado, and people were like, oh, there's a big storm coming. It's going to be 4 inches. And I'm like, oh, I guess. So it's a nice balance. There is snow here, but not a lot.
So what are you drinking?
Today I'm drinking an Angel's Envy, doing it's their port wine bourbon.
And all of that was leading questions so that I can tell you to go try this one, which is Stranahan's.
Oh, are they the sponsor for this video?
They should be. Not yet, but you can be. Any of the guys I drink on here are more than welcome to throw us a little bone. But no, it's a sherry cask, and they have a few different varieties, but this one's a sherry cask, and they're based in Denver. So you're in Colorado, and that is the only connection. But we both like the wine flavored whiskeys. So
that is true. I think the sweeter taste, as we've talked about before, we're both lovers of Scotch. So it's interesting, both liking Scotch, but the different places our palates go.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I do have other things because I film these often in my office, and the bottles rarely leave. So my within arm's reach, I've got lots of stuff available, but there's some pretty peaty stuff down there.
I struggle with the peatiness. I like the I need a little sweeter, mellower taste. I think it's mostly that I just don't do bitters. Too much time near wine country has me too much more with the sweet drinks.
Just too soft. That's all it is.
It's just too soft.
You didn't follow the words in the song. You didn't leave California before it made you soft, but you made it out of the Northeast and New York before it made you hard.
Yeah, I living through COVID and stuff in the Bay Area, and also experiencing a little bit of COVID in Colorado. But I think COVID in California, in Northern California, got combined with the firestorm that took out a bunch of the areas in like Santa Rosa, I think. And I remember waking up and there was like ash clouds and ash covering my porch. And I was down in the south of the Bay. It was this surreal experience of like, what is happening to the world? I've got ash coming down from the ceiling or from the sky. I'm told I can't go outside. It's just like, okay,
I was there to drink. I was there for a little bit during one of those storms, and it was absolutely surreal.
Yeah,
it's crazy. And I just don't know how there's anything left to burn in the north of that state.
Yeah, right. The fires in California they're a big deal. And then I moved to Colorado, and they had the worst fire they've ever had in Colorado a month after I moved.
So it's your fault.
I'm not saying it's strongly correlated. So security.
Strongly correlated is actually a fantastic segue, because you and I have had separate discussions, and unlike some of the guests I have on here, Elliot and I actually go back a little ways here, and we've had lots of conversations. One of the conversations we've had is around the SIM specifically, and about how DevOps and the security team specifically can merge together at the SIM as one of those focal points. And Elliot has a lot of thoughts and a fantastic blog. I'll plug your blog real quick. Elliot's got a fantastic blog where he discusses some of these things. And if you're going through it, you're looking for the one that's got a picture of logs as its head, and go check it out. So let's talk about strongly correlated and how we get the data in. What's the biggest issue with unifying security and DevOps, and making sure that the security is getting the data they need while still supporting the secure delivery of DevOps operations?
I think the biggest challenge, especially with log management, is solving the lack of log problem. It's the something maybe that used to report in isn't, or out of 9 hosts, the 10th one isn't reporting in. And it's really difficult without a lot of planning to figure out, how do you know that you've got everything? Because I know from the security side, from the visibility side, that you want to be able to run a search and say, I am confident that when I ran this IP address, it did not show up anytime older than a certain date. And I am confident that I have all the logs I need in order to be comfortable with knowing that I've ascertained the scope of a breach. But when you have ephemeral infrastructure going up and going down all the time, infrastructure that's reusing the same IP addresses, it feels like the DevOps movement towards ephemerality has just completely kicked security right in the jewels for like, well, what if the same IP address came and went every 5 seconds?
What if indeed, and you guys are persona non grata sometimes for that, right? So how do you overcome the problems that ephemeral infrastructure introduces? And it's not just ephemerality at the 5-second level or the super micro infrastructure build up and tear down. It's ephemerality over the course of a month. Not all security programs are scanning everything every day, right? It's a touch point, a check-in. How do you solve for that? How do you track for, how do I leverage your team to make sure my security department is getting what we need?
I have 2 parts to this question. The first one being, from a raw data perspective, the technique that I've found works really well is for asset management. It's figuring out who can you talk to that actually has the definitive source of truth for what should exist, whether it's like, an ARP table or whether it's like the AWS console, and you're saying, what is everything that exists? And thinking about log management and asset management, like this is a database, and this is like a running series of the things that I know to exist at any given point in time, and using those data sets. So I know I've built automation for things like, hey, we have 10,000 virtual machines. All 10,000 virtual machines need like an OS query data or something. So for something like that, you would have you need to figure out, okay, I have this giant pile of OS query data. Do I have all 10,000 hosts? Did they all check in appropriately? But when you separate that out to, I'm going to have one software process that's trying to determine the source of truth of everything. I'm going to have another software process that tells me what is the unique set of assets that have reported an OS query, delta between the two of them, and you can figure out where those missing pieces are. If an interesting thing I've experimented with is making the DevOps team responsible for that part of the equation and saying, hey, well, the DevOps team will be responsible for confirming as like a host monitor, does every host in your fleet have its logs in the SIM? And it was a really interesting idea for saying, like, let the DevOps team be responsible for that piece. Let them plug it into the monitors that they already run on all that infrastructure already, and say that they're then responsible for those checks. And that worked out really well for confirming that everything that should exist according to the hypervisor has a corresponding entry in security logging.
How do you counter the pushback from that team when security says, an enterprising security analyst somewhere hears those comments come out of your mouth? Enable that security analyst to have that conversation with the DevOps team in their organization. Because when you go there and you say, hey guys, I need you to do this, they say, no, and why? In that order.
I cannot say I've mastered it from the security side's perspective. I can tell you the things that didn't work, which is a close parallel. I think the hard part was I've seen times where the security team would work and they would build up a solution inside their own bubble, and then they'd approach you with what they thought was a exceptionally reasonable set. Like, hey, we've built a dashboard for you, and the dashboard has everything you could possibly need. I need you to be responsible for it. And they're missing things that, just like the security team wants to have a single pane of glass into all the things that you own, the DevOps team does as well. But it's not going to be the SIM. It's going to be like a New Relic or a Datadog. And so it kind of like the same discussion. Security doesn't like it when they're brought in at the very tail end of a thing and then told, hey, can you review this thing that's going to prod tomorrow? And no easy to no end. On the DevOps side, they don't like it when security has done all this research into picking the perfect security tool with all the practices, all the things, all the logs, and then they arrive at the very tail end and say, all right, I just need you to be responsible for this dashboard. And you're like, whoa, man, that doesn't match with any of my processes. It doesn't match with any of my team skills. It doesn't go into the tools we already use. Like, couldn't you have talked to me about this like 6 months ago when you were first doing it? So probably the right answer.
When did you start this project exactly? How long have you known? And why am I only just now hearing about it? I have absolutely had that conversation more often. I'm having flashbacks now, more often than I wish I had, So let's wind it back to the very beginning of any given process, the requirements and architecture. What advice do you have on getting at the requirements stage, even before design and architecture and all that, architecture and design, we should do it in the right order, at the requirements gathering, because security and DevOps and the dev guys, the dev, not DevOps guys, all have unique vernaculars that they all use. They all have their own jargon, their own vocabularies and flow. And Log4j, by the way, is a great example of that, because dev people don't call it Log4j. It's Log4j.
Depends on where you're at.
Yeah.
But yeah, or SLF.
I was viciously corrected early on in that whole debacle by a developer who's like, that's Log4j. We've been using it for however many years. And that's just not what it's called. Like, well, that actually makes moderate sense. So vocabulary issues at the requirements gathering stage, what advice do you have on ensuring a good collaborative process between security and DevOps because we both have to support the developers and the business.
This is going to sound super cheesy, and it's a
It
little
will.
relevant because it's top of my mind, but there's a lot to be gained from thinking through the 7 habits of highly effective people. There's a particular part of it that is talking about the seeking first to understand and the win-win stage. So the way that we got the security and DevOps teams to collaborate well was when the security team was talking to the DevOps team about how can we make sure that we get better monitoring. It started more from an angle of what are the problems that the DevOps team has? And it turns out the DevOps team has a problem that they are missing logs from time to time. So when we scoped out the project for the log management and alerting, we thought of it less as we need to get security log to have a good, healthy reporting cycle. We just need log sources in general, where we can put an array of log sources that we expect to have routine drops of data like syslog. Oh, and also the security tooling. And so by investing on both sides, and there was like permissions we had to change on both sides, but when both groups said, how can I solve an operational problem you have and ask you to take on more responsibility, in the very beginning of the project, it was like, well, now you're speaking my language. You're telling me I can do a little less work or I can solve a problem I have. Hey, my problem is you don't let me use X, Y, or Z technique or technology or something. And we were able to do that. It was the same thing with gravitational teleport as well, which I've seen deployed at multiple places. Like teleport is an amazing example of a tool that significantly improves the security for the security team. At least from my perspective, I think it does. But it also improves operational workflows and makes them a ton easier as well. So I think it's that like seek first to understand, seek win-wins, look for cases where you can actually use the security tooling to benefit operational visibility.
Awesome. I like to hop around a lot, if you can't tell, and you probably watched one of these before you came on, so you already know that a little bit. And you know me, so you know we're going to hop around anyway. What is the single biggest success that most teams should be striving for? And I said success, not goal. Like, what's the biggest success that is achievable? Lots of teams don't, that they should strive for.
What comes to mind, and I hopefully this isn't a bad answer, is sustainability. There will always be mountains of work. There will always be more revenue that needs to get generated, and there will always be another Log4j that like hits the world. And a lot of people push off sustainability of processes, development, work in general. They eat up their personal life. They skip going to the gym. Very guilty of that one. And they put themselves in a position where they're on an unsustainable path. And that unsustainable path starts to eke out toxicity amongst your coworkers and amongst different teams, different people. And it puts you in a position where you're not capable of having effective conversations or making progress. So I think teams should strive for finding ways that they're able to make forward progress sustainably, not based off of heroics.
Yeah, I don't like heroics. I don't like Superman syndrome. Superman syndrome leads to burnout, leads to resentment, leads to lots of things. Now, that's not to say that you won't be periodically called on to go above and beyond. And most successful professionals have and will again be called on to do those things. It happens, right? The reason I was late to today's meeting by a couple minutes is because I was doing a little Supermaning. And hopefully it works out. I'll let you know. But go ahead.
I like to think of it like a bank, where it's like your company occasionally will be like, there is a moment where if you don't put in this disproportionate amount of effort, there's an opportunity for a disproportionate amount of gain, and that's only going to be solved by hours right now. We just got to sink in some more hours. I like to think of it as a withdrawal. They're withdrawing from you, and then everything that the company does to support you in your career and at your company are like deposits into that bank. So you can do some artificial things like, hey, you had to work super late last Friday and last Saturday. I want you to take a couple of days off next week as your withdrawal from it. That's a pretty decent way. But the largest majority of trust deposits into the bank, right, are going to come from just the day-to-day things that the company does to support and encourage you. It could be small things like, hey, after major outages or major surges, we should do a retrospective to talk about how to avoid it. It's like a small little deposit into saying, hey, the company recognizes the time that you put in and doesn't want that to be the norm. So it's actually serious about figuring out how to fix it. So I that would be my perspective on how to balance the times that you need to Superman. And I was working on Log4j, right, Christmas time, right? Like we were all working ridiculous hours. And so then it was like, cool, what did you do in January? Late January for your team?
Yeah, no, totally. It's something you cannot neglect if you'd like to keep your team long-term and have happy people that when you talk to your team. And it is a big challenge, especially in very large companies and smaller companies. Mid-sized companies seem to have a better / easier time with it, but that could just be from the outside looking in, because I've only worked for large organizations and small organizations. I've worked with a lot of medium organizations, never for one.
I think it was the thing that actually my most formative experience that made me want to become a lead. There's like a whole story here. Your brother actually ended up going to a wedding with this guy, and I passed the message through Dathan about how this guy inspired my entire career path. He was very touched. It was amazing that this happened. But so this guy, it was a small organization, and he brought in donuts and stuff, something like every Friday. The company didn't have money. This wasn't a high perk company. He was personally driving every week and buying it on his own credit card, bringing it in, never once saying it was from him. People knew, but he just never rubbed it in that way. He would do small things like we watched an episode of Venture Brothers every Friday for 20 minutes. It's 20 minutes. Who cares? It's Friday. But there was something about it that just kept adding to it. Then partway through at this job, he asked me basically, hey, we have a deadline on Thursday. I need you to do 36 hours worth of work in 2 or 3 days. And I was happy. I was grateful. I was excited because he had built up this realm of like all the things that he did to make a miserable job actually kind of fun. And then as a result, I was like, you need me to help you? This isn't a bad thing. This is the moment I've been waiting for. I got you, man. And I did it. And I look back on that as the best moment of that entire, it was a co-op. The best time of my entire co-op was the 2 days I spent working ridiculous hours to support this person. And I carried that with me throughout my entire life. I remember that story as like, that is the difference between someone that is a great lead and the power that they can have with people.
What's the worst habit for a lead, a director, a VP? What's the worst habit?
Putting your emotions down a level. So I think leads are needed to be a rock, to be someone stable that people can depend on, can come to with interpersonal conflicts and stress to help them sort out. If you start dumping your emotional baggage on your people, I think it undermines that relationship very strongly. And I'm not a hierarchy person from a like, I'm whatever, but just like, I think you should really strive as a lead, especially a senior lead, to be unflappable.
Yep, I agree. Some of the best advice I ever got was while I was at Health and Human Services. It was two things. It was, and we were approaching a burnout period, and I was a director there, and my team was burning out. I was burning out. My boss was burning out, and his boss's boss was like, it was a burnout period, right? We were all Supermaning for too long. And the first thing he said was, Andy, this place is still going to be here tomorrow. It's going to outlive all of us. It's a government institution. The work will still be here tomorrow. It is time for both of us to take a break. Yes, sir. Got that. And he also, one of the leadership lessons he taught me that I didn't know before I worked for him is when a bad decision comes down, I know it came from leadership. I know it was direct. When it's something I disagree with and I've had my say and I got overruled and all that kind of stuff, that when it comes down, whatever that final decision is, and it gets to me, it's still my decision. Because people forget that you always do have a choice, right? You could quit. If I felt strongly enough against that decision, I could quit, right? at which point I'm under no obligation to hold my tongue because it was that bad. But if I don't quit and I go ahead and I pass the order down, it's mine. The moment I take it and I hand it off to my team, it's not the thing leadership is doing to us. It's the thing I'm now doing, which means we are now doing. And that was a very powerful shift in perspective and was part of that don't drop the baggage down. Right?
That resonates strongly with me.
Even if I'm pissed off, even if it's, how can you possibly think this is a good idea, leadership people, et cetera, right? When it comes time to put it to my team, and at the time I had a team of 60 people. When it comes time to put it to my team, it's me. I'm the one that's doing that. I'm the one that's passing that on. And I'm the one that's going to lead the team through whatever friction that thing I disagreed with is going to introduce, right? But it's my decision. It's not the thing that's being done to us. It's the direction the organization's taking, and we're on board.
There's so many taglines that go with that. There's the disagree and commit. Like there's a bunch of those, but you're right. Like at the core of it, it's that you're an at-will employee. You're choosing to remain there. You have people in positions where their job is to make calls. And, if you're in an organization that won't even hear feedback back that you disagree with it, that's a toxic organization. Run for the hills. But you also have to have I presented that counterpoint and the other people didn't agree. And I am part of that leadership team. And, not get in my way, but that's fine. We've agreed as a collective to move as a collective. You can't have when every organization just fights with themselves and creates little fiefdoms, that is pure toxicity. So to work as a leadership team, you have to accept that sometimes, you're going to have to present things to your team that, maybe you wanted to do otherwise.
Absolutely. But when you present them, they're yours.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming out of your mouth or your email or whatever, right?
Yeah, one of the worst things you can do as a lead is when you present that idea down and you taint the well, you taint it, right? And you say we're going to have to do this thing because of this idea that I don't agree with, but we're going to do it anyway. And you just, boop, there you go. You just ruined it. You just ruined the chance for everyone to take pride in what they're doing.
Well, and you've pre-colored their opinions of the direction, and all those things. You've tainted the well. I think you said it best. I don't have much to add to that. What's the number one sign you're in an empowering or employee-focused empowering organization? What's the number one sign?
Oh man, give me a second.
Since we're veering very off to the right, these things or the left. I don't know which direction this went. Up, downhill, something like that. We're off security. We'll come back to it. Organizations and keeping people employed and happy. What's the number one sign or the thing you look for? I'll add to it to help you figure out an answer because you've done great so far. That you're at an empowering organization.
I think the thing I look for when looking at a new organization and trying to figure out if it's the right fit is information flow. How do projects get decided? How are retrospectives done? Just in general, and it's that two-way communication. It's hey, is project planning someone at the top set the thing, that set the thing, that set the thing? And, there's some advantages in having a top-level leader that set a vision, a very clear, we need to achieve X by Y, and that's the piece. But at the same time, looking for that, where do all the individuals, all the employees, where do they get their venue to express what they think the next set of the priority tree should be? So I know for some of the DevOps teams that I've led, we created systems before we did project planning, we started with asking everyone their opinion on what we should prioritize for the good of the team. And it was really important we did that before anyone had any ideas, before leadership got involved with suggestions or mandates on what to do, such that the first thing on our list were the ideas that came from internally, and then keeping those ideas and making sure recognition came back to those individuals that pushed those things. And I know some of the most impactful projects I ever did came from individuals on the IC level recognizing that there was a problem that needed to get fixed. So I think that's my stance is information flow.
Well, they know where the friction points are, right? The pinch points, the guillotines. I want to circle back because you are one of the more knowledgeable, and I'm sure that you feel like there are people who know way more than you, because I feel like I know lots of people who I defer to on lots of topics. But you, for me, are one of the more knowledgeable DevOps folks I know, both as a DevOps leader and a DevOps practitioner. What's the number one most overlooked thing in DevOps? Not necessarily the overlooked security thing, unless it happens to be a security thing. What's the number one most overlooked thing in DevOps?
Security. I'm not trying to be cheesy, but it is shocking how little thought people put into security. Like, I think it's because they come from a software background that is extremely devoid of good security practices, like through college and stuff like that. Like, those things aren't really covered. Then they end up on infrastructure, and especially DevOps is pushing towards this movement a lot of automating infrastructure, and there's so little thought put into the security of the CI and CD parts of architecture. I don't know if you
my audience may not universally know what CI is. Please tell them.
Oh, continuous integration. So this is you make a change, you put it into GitHub, that needs to turn into a product at some point. To turn that into a product, there's all these secrets you usually have to have access to, whether it's signing keys or publishing keys or different points. And the trivialness in which you can usually make a pull request and echo out all the secrets, like Circle CI, Jenkins, GitHub Actions, most of them support this idea where you could your pull request is just emailing you the environment variables, and you'll probably walk away with a publishing secret that you could use to undermine the entire business. It's shockingly easy. A group I'm pretty proud of, or just excited for, Cider CI. I don't know if you saw their announcement. They got bought by Palo Alto Networks Prisma Cloud, but they were the first ones to really work on automated CI/CD vulnerability scanning as a concept. And it was I was very attached to that mission, because that's it's a very overlooked part of DevOps, where, Terraform, the most common tool in DevOps, basically requires that you give it administrative AWS credentials. And it is trivial to just create your own Terraform provider that just sends you back the credentials that you got from the build. And now you've just got admin to everything. Like, it is shocking how few people think about that attack vector.
There's a couple people who just heard you say that who are now panicking. Have a drink. That is part of the point of the show. Let what Elliot just said sink in. I wasn't positive that was going to be the answer, that security was the number one most neglected or missed thing in DevOps across, as a whole, not any single or one shop. I will say that I think that DevOps is a miss for security too. There's a whole lot of people in security who don't really understand what DevOps is. And so now, with that lack of understanding as the underpinning for the next question, Elliot, what is zero trust?
Man, as someone, I should have a much snappier, Googled response for this, but zero trust is the assumption that you don't have that nothing should be unauthenticated, that everything requires the proof that you are who you are. And it's not because you have access to a network. It's not because you happen to be in a location, but you've got more than just that. That's my best version of it, but it feels very raw.
It is pretty raw. I'm not going to correct you. I will say that the reason I did that is because there's a lot of people who have opinions. You say zero trust and they're like, well, that's not possible. I'm like, have you read the white paper? Have you read the NIST architecture? Have you, what when you hear zero trust, what are you referring to? Are you just hearing that you just can't trust anything ever? Because that's not what any of the seminal works or the later defined NIST standards actually say, right? There and I've talked to the original author of Zero Trust.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's a pretty cool guy. I should see if he'll come on this show. But John, his name is John Kindervag, and he says that one of the problems is that people hear trust, and trust is an emotion. How do you measure an emotion, right? It was a great name. It's gotten people talking. It's kept people talking. Frankly, it's been good for his career. He didn't say that, but it has. It's been good for John's career. that people keep talking, and he is the seminal author. The problem with trust is that it's an emotion. It anthropomorphizes the problem right up front instead of allows you a way to measure. And and confidence, however, is measurable.
Mhm.
And so, if you replace confidence or trust with confidence, you substitute the words, you get closer immediately to what you're actually after. How confident, and what's your threshold of confidence where you're willing to engage, i.e., trust, emotionally make the human decision to trust and put that decision into your machine, which can't trust anything but can generate a confidence score. At what point, at what confidence level that you are who you say you are you willing to engage in that activity?
Oh, I like that a lot.
I wish I could take credit for it, but it's not mine.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like I've been in DevOps for a very long time. I've been doing security for a very long time. But when you bring up something like, hey, what's the standard definition for something that I'm sure almost every security person on this podcast is like, maybe to a degree can say it very quickly. But I think on my side, I'm mostly dictated to like, hey, you need to meet this security bar, you need to do these pieces. And it gets back to that collaborative piece of like, I was never sat down and actually said like, hey, you should read this whole thing. You should understand this whole idea from a broader context. It was much more like, here's the policy that is required to be implemented. Now go implement it.
That's a very interesting. I think that actually tells a lot about the state of the two disciplines and the interactions between us, because I've written some of those policies and then I've handed them off, right? But I don't remember having a get together and saying, is there anything here that doesn't actually make sense to you? Do you understand why this policy is being put in place? What the purpose of these controls, what the types of the controls are from a security perspective, right? Do you any questions about any of that? I've never once had that discussion. And I think I probably the next time that opportunity comes up will absolutely engage in that discussion. Make sure that the policy I'm promulgated is both necessary, which it usually is, and understood, not just implemented blindly.
If I was going to give a shout out to Palantir's current CISO, that'd be Dane Stuckey. I thought he was good at this. He would routinely put together security educational practices and like spent a lot of his team's effort thinking through education as like a huge part of the vector of what he was supposed to do. And albeit we didn't cover zero trust, but I can think of a lot of other topics where it came down to him saying, hey, come to my laptop. I will show you exactly what it feels like to do X, Y, or Z, or why these things are important. And I carry a lot of the lessons that he taught me for a very long time.
I've definitely done the learning and training and socializing security sessions, but I've never done it around a specific policy that was being implemented. That's where the gap I think is. And I don't know if he also did that, but like when I bring an access control that has to be enforced because of whatever compliance reason or customer requirement or whatnot to the infrastructure team, whether it's a DevOps infrastructure or a traditional enterprise architecture infrastructure, right? When I bring that to them and I say, we have to do this, go do it. I haven't stopped. And at that point, we've done lunch and learns, we've done seminars. I've spoken at the company-wide meetings. My team has interacted with them. But when we present that control, that actual touch point where we are promulgating change, that's not where we're engaging in that discussion, or at least even opening the door for it. And I'm willing to bet that across the board, most of my peers are behaving in same or similar ways across all enterprises, that a lot of us are good, and many are better than me at providing educational opportunities. But I don't think we're as good as we could be, and maybe as beneficial to the organizations we serve, if we were to do it at the point in time where the change and the friction are introduced.
Some of that for some individuals might come down to, sometimes like from an infrastructure perspective, sometimes the perspective of security is that security will just come by and they will tell you, you must do this thing, and that is it. I am the one in charge to a degree, like this is what you have to do. But I've also talked on the security side where they have felt like they're the powerless ones, and that they keep telling people you need to do things a certain way, but then it doesn't get done, and then there's no consequences for not following those policies. Again, I'm not saying every policy everywhere. But at least it feels like on both sides, people feel a level of disempowerment. And I wonder to some degree with some of the policy things, whether there are some people who are afraid to talk through the underlying motivations and rationales and other pieces because they're afraid of opening the door that might turn it into a debate. And then it will turn into an argument about whether or not to implement it, whereas it's easier to come by and say, this is the policy that must be implemented. I wonder if there is a piece of that for at least someone on this who watches this, who goes like, hey, maybe I can discuss that policy and the rationales behind it. It doesn't have to turn into, a debate over whether or not to do it at all.
Yeah, totally. And I hope it's not a debate over whether or not to do it at all, right? Because it needs to get done. But there's definitely, that's probably an opportunity right there that we've surfaced through discussion and distillation, which is the whole point of the show, where some programs could be improved.
I think a lot of it in this particular case comes down to tone, which is interesting. Like, you can lean in very hard when delivering the message about a new policy to be, this is the thing you have to do. If you'd like to talk about why, I'm here for it, which just comes across like a very like someone talking down to you, as opposed to an angle where you can start off with, this is the policy you need to implement. And I believe that, like, this is my rationale for why I believe this is the correct path. If you can think you can implement this in an even better way, I'm all for better security, right? Like, this is what I think though the right path is. I think it's like that slight difference between saying I am open to an alternative path that involves more security, if you can present one.
Right.
At least that's how on the DevOps side, if I could, it's the way I would want to receive new policy information and things like that, is feeling like I have the ability to affect the decision around what we're doing, around what the security policy will be. Even if in the end of the day, there's only one clear answer because you're the professional who's thought through it. It's still nice to feel like I am a seat at the table. I'm not just being dictated to.
What's the one question you never asked a CISO that you wish you could, or you wish you had, or you want to, but didn't think it was appropriate at the time? Like, what do you want to ask a CISO?
I've gotten drunk with enough CISOs that I can't think of a question that I haven't been brutally willing to ask, but I do have a question, a philosophical question.
That works. That qualifies.
Backups and disaster recovery. Is it a DevOps problem or a security problem? Because you were bringing up what's the number one thing that is overlooked on the DevOps side, and I'd say security. On the security side, I've struggled to get security people to care a lot about backups and the availability side of CIA.
So for anybody who knows me, please know that I did not set Elliot up for that question. Because for me, I have a little bit of a unique background for a CISO in that one of the certifications I still do maintain is a certified business continuity planner, which I think has helped make me a more effective CISO because I take into account the things about continuity of business focus first, as well as the recovery of things that is implied in business continuity planning and disaster recovery. Disaster recovery being in the business continuity field, disaster recovery being the technical component, the IT component of the business continuity plan. Connotatively, a lot of people don't draw those two things together unless they've actually been presented the material. So for anybody out there listening who isn't familiar, that is the case. And so for me, it's important, but it's also important not just because I have a business continuity background, but it's because I've, as an incident response specialist, which is my field specialty, other than being a strategic CISO leader type person, right? Which is something I worked into, but you do something before you become that. And incident response was one of my things. And so I've got about somewhere north of 120 incidents under my belt in terms of, and when I say incidents, I don't mean like we had an alert and somebody had to investigate it. I mean, bad stuff happened and the plan needed to go into effect. I've got about 120 plus of those under my belt. And the majority of those are ransomware attacks. And ransomware attacks, there are certain fundamental things that make you able to respond to the attack effectively, with the ability to recover being chief among those things. And there's lots of other lots of other fundamental underpinnings around the resiliency and stuff like that, what makes you a resilient organization. But if you can't recover, you're dead in the water.
Mhm.
And I don't care if it's a ransomware attack that took you out or a flood. If you can't recover, you're dead in the water. Security has to care. Has to care. I'm going to say that again. But this is one of those places where partnership is critical, because in day-to-day operations, security is not responsible for the enterprise operations function of conducting backups and doing one-off recoveries of, oh crap, I deleted that file, I shouldn't have. That is patently an enterprise operations function. Security has to partner with infrastructure and enterprise operations in whatever form or flavor they take in any given organization to be able to ensure that in the event that the balloon goes up, it's the ransomware or whatever other attack can cause you to need this capability, that you're able to and have the capability to recover from that incident. And it doesn't matter what it is. And so any strategic level, high level practicing security leader, and when I say leader, I don't mean like is a field visionary or anything like that. I mean, who has a program they're responsible for, whether you're the only security person or you lead a team of 50 security people, who neglects the A in CIA doesn't have the triangle in place. It's the CIA.
It's a line.
It's a line. It's a nice horizon. It's whatever it is, but you are not managing your actual obligations under the core tenet of our profession. And I'll go ahead and be out there and say, if you don't think availability is also your problem, you're doing it wrong.
So on the DevOps side, I've spent a ton of time with, everything comes down to incentive structures, right? So on the DevOps side, we're very quick to create backups. We're very quick to have like, yeah, of course, I'm going to take a backup of that thing. Where it strays from being an operational problem towards being an interesting security problem is like, well, yes, if I'm the one who takes the backup, I have the access to delete the backup. And it's like, oh, well, maybe hand that to another team. And it's like, well, but then that team, someone's going to manage Active Directory or someone's the owner of the secret management system. And you get into this like horrible rabbit hole of thinking through like, who's the one person that if you put a gun to their head and said, it's either your kids or delete the data, and you should delete the data for the record. Between those choices, it's just an interesting rabbit hole for strategy on that. And then the costs associated with it, interesting. So, again, I'm very much separating availability, disaster recovery just from availability standpoint from natural disasters. But what if there was a targeted attack on an administrator? And then how much are you willing to spend to circumvent that? Because that can get pretty expensive pretty quickly.
So fundamentals is what comes into place here. You should not be using the same credentials in both places. It's that simple. There are all types of segmentation. Segmentation is one of the core fundamentals that everybody should have in place. MFA is also something that is fundamental that should be in place. And these are what I consider ransomware fundamentals specifically. You need to have a recovery plan. You need to be training your people. You have to have segmentation, and segmentation is physical segmentation, physical and logical segmentation, and it can be all the way down to the data layer inside there, right? You gotta make sure you're managing your authentication properly, and you have to be able to recover. And you apply those fundamentals across the board. MFA should be in place, and it should be a separate credential. So you have the MFA control that prevents 80% of attacks right off the bat. And then even if your enterprise credential is compromised, that admin account that can go break stuff, and you should have a payment system in place if you're at any kind of scale that minimizes the likelihood of that happening too. And you absolutely, regardless of your scale, should not be using the same account for daily business that you use for administration. It's all about segmentation and separation of duties. That there is always something that can break you. There's no way to accomplish something, no risk, no reward. Right? You cannot accomplish any function in the enterprise without having a point of failure potential. But you can take tons of steps, simple, easy steps. Just don't use the same credentials. go as far as not storing those same credentials in the same password vault. Have two accounts with a different way to get into them. Have one secret that isn't kept in your password vault, and it happens to be the backup recovery, right? Whatever that is, and make sure it's a long and memorable password that is like your favorite quote from Edgar Allan Poe or something that is 256 characters in length and would have made a great tweet, but it's your password, right? The backups deserve that kind of attention. Focus on the fundamentals and they'll take care of you. Segment that, protect that. It is a risk. You cannot get rid of it, but that's my answer is don't go down the rabbit hole. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Follow some basic fundamentals and move on with business, because that's what we do. We support and conduct business.
And that's why I think part of it, as you said, is a collaboration. On the security side, being part of the driver for that conversation, I think is very important, because the incentive structure for a DevOps team, again, just from our perspective, what are we rewarded by? You said it earlier, it's keeping the IT operations set of the world working. It's keeping things running is what we're rewarded for. And so you need someone who's like, hey, my job is to manage risk. And again, DevOps people don't go through risk training, risk analysis, and all those other pieces. They are much more focused on how do you make this run as cheaply as possible, as available as possible, as fast as possible, all those types of pieces. But I definitely say for any security person who is, who watches this later, is to really think through, hey, your DevOps team is not highly motivated to think through backup security. It's not the thing that they're probably going to do on their own. You need to be a driving factor towards that, because it's not going to come up for them unless you're the one that brings it up. Not all organizations, but it will be true for some.
Absolutely. That was a good question, though. Not enough people asked that question. And now I'm actually looking for something right now, because I was going to share it, but I didn't find it in time.
To plug my blog, I have a whole, the It's Fine meme. I have a whole thing on disaster recovery and thinking through who all those pieces. So backups has been something I've always been passionate about. Actually, well, for a shout out for if Andrew Chang ever watches this, I cared about backups because of an individual on my team that was pioneering and pushing for us to care more about it. And he convinced me. And then once I really started to wrap my mind around it, this was like 8 years ago, I suddenly realized how little thought I'd put into our backups besides let's take them. So I had a formative experience with an engineer, very excellent engineer.
I thought I found that thing, and apparently it has been removed. My retention period has my data controls are working. My retention period is solid.
While bringing up a couple of these pieces, it's one of the things that I do really like about cloud providers. And I know there's some level of cloud provider where there are people who are like, never trust the cloud, run everything yourself. But I've often found that my own incompetence is the biggest risk to the business. not necessarily AWS's, and that's a whole thing. But I have found AWS has been implementing more features like their backup vaults with their required retention periods and other pieces that are surprisingly nice and easy to use for people that are trying to set up backup policies where they can't delete the data. They have a lot of you can write it, but then you can't delete it for 30 days. And they're really easy to use. So there's been a lot of interesting automation there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think something AWS and the other major cloud providers too, but AWS is obviously the biggest one. So we'll treat the elephant in the room to its attention. I think what they do a really good job of is listening to and identifying actual concerns for operation and then productizing against them. They also have a good culture of listening for ideas and sorting through and actioning the ones that are actually. Sometimes they even action things that we didn't think were doable, but they have a good culture of listening and watching for ideas. Google takes that culture to the next level, and they have a habit of trying every crazy idea, and they get some of us hooked on their services, and then they discontinue them later. I think you can rely on AWS. It's cruel. I have definitely lost some Google services I was using. And apparently I was the only one in the world using it though, so it died.
A lot of that comes down to, I'm a big believer, the thing that I believe in all of life is that things come down to incentive structures and how incentive structures are set up and determining things. Like, as you said before, your organizational structure has a huge effect on the outcomes that people end up achieving or being able to do. And when I think about like Amazon, I know they are highly motivated to have segmented teams that each are delivering pretty competitively relative to themselves. As a result, their product looks like a series of building blocks. And those building blocks do not always play well together, but they work well as individual building blocks relative to themselves. And then Google is rewarded, at least historically, for the creation of new ideas, not the maintenance therein. So their constant vomiting of new things is pretty appealing, but then the maintenance and the evolution of those things over time is quite lackluster. But that's also the incentive structure and how their compensation philosophies work. So yeah, I think you can learn a lot by, I'm thinking of the book, it doesn't matter, that the organization of your organization has such an enormous impact on what you do. Moonshots.
Yeah, Moonshots. That's the name of the book, right?
Moonshots. Yeah, he goes through a bunch of those different philosophies and ideas, and I thought that's a very good book if you haven't read it. I think it sounds like you've read it.
I haven't read that one. I've read excerpts. I have not read the whole book, but it sounds like I need to. Right now, the book I'm reading is The Princess Bride. Specifically, nice. I'm reading it to my kids every night. So I'll pick up something for me again later, but that's how I'm spending my free reading time right now. But Moonshots is now on the reading list.
My Loonshots, L.
Loon. See, that's why I had to ask, because I thought Loon.
I'm also reading a book to my daughter. It's just the numbers 1 through 10, except she's decided that her favorite number is 8, and she'll cry until I flip to that page. Then she'll say 8, and then she'll close the book, and that's it. That's our reading time.
It gets more complex. Your daughter is clearly younger than mine, which I already knew, but demonstrably, if I didn't know that clearly. So I found the thing I was looking for, and the fundamentals for ransomware that I've got documented as my philosophy written down is MFA is the first control, because it solves for roughly 82%, depending on which study you read, of most attacks that matter. Data backup and recovery are all on the same line, and there's extra things in there that if you drill down and you expand, I like to talk about things like file integrity monitoring, backup validation, making sure the things you backed up are the things you thought you backed up, making sure nothing has happened to them, watching for things like file inflation or change. I like honeypot files, something. So I don't know if I've ever talked about this on an episode before, but something I call poor man's FIM, file integrity monitoring, is you come up with a file that is all yours, that should never be used and nobody should ever want to touch. It can be the unabridged works of Shakespeare in plain text. It's fine, doesn't matter what it is. And those are free copyright, right? You can take those and do whatever you want with them. And you put them somewhere where your sensitive data are. You put it right next to it. And if anybody is serially going down that list and looking to do damage and make changes to files that they shouldn't be, nobody should ever be doing anything that covers your file. Your file is only there for you. It's not part of a batch. It's not named in the same way as everything else. It's not one of those series. And so you watch that and you look for things like, did the hash change? Did the size inflate? Do a diff on the contents? It's all stuff that can be easily scripted in PowerShell if you want, or pick your language, doesn't matter, right? Don't get, all you scripting people don't get tied up in my in my choice of how I might implement it. Implementation method doesn't matter, only that you do it. The means to the end don't matter. The end is what matters here. And so after that, I've got segmentation. I talked about that earlier, so I won't dive into that, except I also, in my write-up, I discuss permissions as a form of segmentation. And that's where that use a different account. If it's truly that important, if it is one of those shining jewels that can take your organization to the ground, make sure that you give it the attention it deserves. Security awareness and education is squarely in the middle of my priorities. And then planning, plan. Practice the plan, plan some more. Practice the plan, plan some more. You have to have a plan. And it doesn't matter if the plan is actually right. It matters that you've taken the time to work on planning. Incident response, have an approach to it. And disaster recovery is tightly coupled to incident response in my write-up, because in the case of ransomware, which is what the write-up is about, disaster recovery is a component of a response to an active ransomware attack, period. Last but not least is business continuity, because if things go sideways, how are you going to keep the business running and buy yourself the time to recover before everybody's out of a job? Those are those fundamentals. And I say all of that to move on to the other column on this page that you can't see and talk about tools. Because when we talk about security and when we talk about DevOps, and even just now, we've talked about some tools. You've named a bunch of tools throughout our discussion. And Terraform is the most common this, and that might be a Datadog or a New Relic, right? For the DevOps single pane of glass and all that kind of stuff. The discussion on capabilities so often comes down to tools. Ransomware relies on practice. There isn't a tool that just solves for it. You have to use tools to implement practice. But when people think security and they think security stuff, they think things like EDR or advanced malware protection, email security, phishing. I'm reading the list. A real file integrity monitoring tool, not the hack job I described as an option. NDR, IDS, IPS, all those things. CMDB and ticketing, right? Vulnerability management. These are all security things. And some people think that these things are fundamental to a security program. Some of them are fundamental to a compliant security program, where I can show PCI DSS compliance because I did my proper vulnerability scanning, or I can demonstrate that these controls are in place against this compliance framework over here. But in the face of some threats, the tools are no longer fundamental. They are nice to haves, not need to haves. What nice to have gets inappropriately tagged as a need to have, in your opinion, most often? That was a long-winded way to get to my question.
Yeah. I mostly think about the other one. What are things that people think are nice to have or closer to need to haves than they realize?
I'll take that. Go for it.
Documentation.
People really think documentation is a nice to have?
Well, it's every disaster. I've done a lot of tabletop disaster recovery exercises and help new teams get started on it. And so you start off and they're like, all right, disasters happened. All these things happened. Now, where do you start with? And they're never like, oh, well, I would restore the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, great. How do you know what to do? And they're like, well, look at the docs. It's like, yeah, the docs are gone now because you hosted them on the same infrastructure you hosted everything else on. And they go, shit. Well, it's in source control. It's like, yeah, but you're using, Bitbucket server. So it's also hosted on the same infrastructure. And they got you, man. They got you. And they're like, okay, well, I don't have any docs. It's like, okay, how long would it take you to recover these services if you didn't have the documentation? And they're usually the answer is like 10 to 100 times longer than if I knew the exact command that restores the right table in the right way. And people don't do printed off. The common one is like, do you print off copies of your disaster recovery guides? How do you get back on VPN? Like, oh, well, I'd pull the secret or something, So, how do you recover your VPN from a distance without having access to the documentation? It's like, did you print out copies of all those things? It sounds silly, but it's just one of those, like, it doesn't take that much effort to print off after a tabletop exercise. Just print off your backup guides and toss them in a safe.
It really doesn't. And we live in a digital era, so people often do not think about just printing. My printer's right there. It doesn't get a whole lot of use. It's out of blue toner.
You can't print color, color pretty print. Yeah, it's surprising how much people will spend all this effort to back up data, but then not think about all the supporting services, or that they wouldn't have access to GitHub. Like one of those, oh, I would run this thing, but it's like, oh yeah, but if you didn't have access to source control, how do you know what you were meant to be launching? How do you know any of those pieces? And some of them are like, I could just figure it out on my own by just looking at the system. But I can definitely say for some circumstances, you're like, well, there's 100,000 copies of those. Like there's 100,000 images in the system. How do you know which one of those images was the one you needed to launch? And it's like, fuck, man.
Yeah. Procedurally, if you have the documentation, you know exactly which one. But if you don't have the documentation, how would you ever know?
So I think the I think that'd be my answer to the question. And honestly, I haven't thought a lot about systems that people tag as must-haves that they don't need to have. I'm curious what your answer is. So I feel like my experience has been that people underscope more than overscope, but I have a more limited experience in the world.
I'm not sure if you're being kind or called me old.
Little column A, little column B.
Little column A, little column B, right there. Yeah. I would say that it varies organization to organization, but I have run into lots of places where they have tools that they don't actually need against their risk profile that they think is absolutely critical, while they've neglected documentation. Right? Because for me, documentation is table stakes, non-starter. Like, you don't have a program if you don't have documentation that is accessible, right? So I would say, well, FIM is a tool that some people think you have to have, that you absolutely do not have to have. There are workarounds. There is also a lot of other detection mechanisms that detect bad guys at an earlier stage in the attack. Because, by the way, if you have FIM, and FIM is a great tool, I'm not pooping on FIM here, but if you are detecting an attack at the FIM stage, at the FIM level, that attack has already happened. You are fighting in your bedroom.
Yeah.
Right? You are fighting in the house, in the inner sanctum of your house already. You have missed every other opportunity. And so it's really, and DLP is another one, right? DLP is a after the bad stuff is underway tool. It does not stop the bad thing before it happens. It doesn't detect the bad thing before it happens. It tries to stop the bad thing while it's happening. The bad thing is already done. The command to do the thing has already happened. So DLP, you know what? That's my answer. DLP.
It's interesting. Yeah, no, I wanted to bring up backups as the topic just because it's interesting how it, I think from the different perspectives, how much it's both underdone and overdone, and how it's, just, I feel like it's very poorly thought out, and a lot of people's strategy to having like a good plan doesn't take the risk into effect. Like, I know I've definitely been on a team watching as DevOps engineers are coming up with all these different ways that they could make the recovery smoother and spend dozens of hours on it. And you're one of those like, dude, if this happens, the world's already on fire. We can spend a week to get the service back up because you're, planning for multi-region outages. It's like, I don't know if we want to spend $1 million on that problem, man. I don't think we do.
I do find myself asking people what problem they're actually solving for a lot lately. What problem are we solving for? Because you've certainly given a lot of thought to this, and you've got an elegant and functional yet Rube Goldberg like solution set developed. What was the problem we were actually solving for? And it usually gives pause for thought, and they're like, "Oh, I'm kind of never mind." That's usually the answer.
You've said this before, and it resonated strongly with me. Just the idea of thinking about the business value of like, what is the business impact of a certain risk against the likelihood of it happening versus, but really just thinking about what is this worth it to the business? Like, you can't spend an infinite amount of money. You can't spend $10 million of revenue per year on backups if you only make 1 million in revenue. You have to balance everything against the needs of the business. And it's one of the things I admire a lot about security professionals is DevOps is a little more like narrowed in on just infrastructure, and security is given this much broader mandate of the longevity and safety of the business. And you're doing risk analysis of the business at large. And I do admire that for security professionals, because that's a lot of different balls to keep in the air.
It is a lot of balls to keep in the air, but you never get bored.
Perks.
That's right. You never get bored. So I would love to keep talking about everything for a long time with you, but I know you have somewhere you have to be soon. So we'll go ahead and rein it in here. give us your parting thoughts, and I'll plug your blog one more time. Go check out Elliot's blog, and we'll see if we can't get the link in the description of this video so that you can go check it out. I'm personally, I would say I'm a reader, but I think I'm a contributing editor on some of these, but I am a fan irrespective of what my role is with the blog. Parting thoughts, Elliot? I hope you had an enjoyable time here on Cybersecurity
This was
Distilled.
great.
Good.
I think I'd say in general, my parting thoughts for all security folks and DevOps folks in general is that both people are on the same team and they both have the same mission of making the business successful. And the more you can do to understand the other person's motivations and perspectives, and the more you can have empathy towards the pain that the other person is doing, the further along everyone's objectives will get, because you're actually all on the same team. So collaboration and empathy, I think, are things we should all strive to get better at.
Cheers.
Cheers, sir.
And that'll do it for this episode. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you made it to the end. This has been Cybersecurity Distilled, an Apollo Information Systems production. And thanks so much, Elliot. We're glad to have you.
Thanks, Ben.